Welcome to Aging in Recovery. I'm Gil Cintron, licensed master social worker and founder of Never Alone Home Care Services, Incorporated. What I know about addiction does not come primarily from textbooks, diagnostic manuals, or clinical theories. My understanding comes first from lived experience and second from decades of professional observation as a social worker working among people struggling with substance use disorders, recovery, homelessness, trauma, incarceration, and aging. I have lived through addiction personally. I participated in multiple forms of treatment. My first experience was with the so-called Rockefeller program, the Narcotics Addiction Control Commission in New York City. I lived in several therapeutic communities, and I actually graduated from one, eventually becoming a substance abuse counselor myself. At one point, because to the therapeutic community I appeared stable and compliant, I was even granted drinking privileges, something that was done in that era. Yet, despite all of these interventions, despite periods of abstinence, despite counseling, structure, education, and professional involvement in the field itself, I repeatedly returned to addiction. I think that's called relapse. The experience fundamentally shaped my understanding of the difference between abstinence and recovery. For years, I could stop using substances temporarily. I would remain abstinent for periods of time, but abstinence alone did not fundamentally alter the internal compulsive process that defined my addiction. Eventually, I would return to alcohol, a socially accepted drug. And once I returned to alcohol, I inevitably returned to my favorite drug of choice. My life repeatedly cycled through addiction, instability, and criminal justice involvement. What finally changed my life was not simply treatment. What changed my life was a complete transformation in thinking, behavior identity, accountability, and worldview through long-term recovery principles grounded in total abstinence and sustained behavioral change. What finally changed my life was not simply treatment. What changed my life was a complete transformation in thinking, behavior, identity, accountability, and worldview through long-term recovery principles grounded in total abstinence and sustained behavioral change. On October 12, 2026, I will celebrate 38 years of being clean. Not controlled drinking, not occasional use, not substitution, not better management, but total abstinence and a path of recovery. 38 years without alcohol or any other substance. 38 years without being incarcerated. That lived experience profoundly informs how I understand addiction today. I believe addiction is fundamentally different from ordinary substance use. Many people can drink socially or experiment with substances without becoming consumed by them. People without addiction can stop. They can walk away. They do not become obsessed and compulsive. They do not reorganize their entire lives around obtaining, using, recovering from, and repeating substance use. People with addiction are different. We experience compulsion and obsession in ways that fundamentally alter decision-making, behavior, priorities, relationships, and identity itself. That is why I continue to embrace the disease concept of addiction. Not because it excuses behavior, but because it explains why certain individuals lose the ability to safely use mood-altering substances while others do not. I know several people who could have one or two drinks socially and then stop. I'm not one of them. Once I introduce alcohol into my system, the entire addictive cycle is reignited. That pattern repeated itself over and over and over again, despite treatment interventions, counseling knowledge, and periods of abstinence. This is why I draw a distinction between abstinence and recovery. Abstinence simply means non-use. Recovery is something much deeper. Recovery is an ongoing life process of internal and external transformation. It involves behavioral change, emotional change, social change, spiritual change, relational change, and identity reconstruction. It is not simply the absence of substance. A person may be abstinent while still emotionally volatile, dishonest, manipulative, self-destructive, criminally involved, isolated, or psychologically unchanged. From my perspective, that is not recovery. That is just suspended consumption. Recovery begins when the individual fundamentally changes how they live, think, relate, and function in the world. This distinction is critical because much of modern addiction discourse continues to focus heavily on symptom management, medication strategies, relapse reduction, and short-term stabilization. While those interventions may help some individuals survive, I remain unconvinced that the field has produced significant evidence demonstrating widespread, decades-long transformational recovery outcomes through many of those approaches alone. What is striking to me is that many of the professionals and researchers who debate recovery often lack meaningful, longitudinal exposure to communities of people with 30, 40, or 50 years of continuous recovery. I do not. I personally know hundreds of individuals living in long-term recovery across the United States. I know people with over 5 decades of being clean and living wonderful lives. I know older adults who rebuilt entire lives around profound addiction histories. I know older adults who rebuilt entire lives after profound addiction histories. Those individuals are not statistical abstractions to me. They are living proof that long-term recovery is possible. Yet, paradoxically, society rarely sees them. One reason is anonymity. Many long-term recovery communities intentionally avoid public self-promotion and public identification. As a person in long-term recovery, I respect those traditions deeply. I do not publicly identify myself as representing or speaking for any type of recovery mode. However, I believe anonymity has unintentionally contributed to a major social blind spot. Society sees active addiction because active addiction is public. Overdoses, arrests, psychiatric crises, homelessness, incarceration, emergency rooms, and public suffering. But society rarely sees the older adult with 40 years or more clean, quietly living, responsibly, working, mentoring others, raising families, participating in communities, and aging with dignity. As a result, the public narrative becomes dominated by pathology rather than recovery. This invisibility has enormous consequences for policy, healthcare, social work, housing, and aging services. Systems were built to address active addiction, crisis intervention, and short-term treatment. Very few systems were designed to address what happens after people survive addiction and remain in recovery for decades. The development of Never Alone home care services and the aging in recovery residential model did not emerge from theory alone. It emerged from decades of direct observations with recovery communities, where I began noticing a growing number of older adults aging in long-term recovery. In many recovery settings, they include meetings specifically focused on aging and recovery. Older recovering individuals openly discussed the realities of aging, chronic illness, isolation, mobility limitations, grief, and the challenge of maintaining recovery while navigating the physical and emotional realities of growing older. I began noticing recurring patterns. Many older adults in recovery were single. Many lived alone. Some had become disconnected from family systems over the course of their addiction, incarceration, or decades of social disruption. Others had outlived spouses, partners, or recovery peers. Increasingly, I observed individuals requiring home attendants, home health aides, transportation assistance, medication management, and supportive services while simultaneously attempting to preserve the recovery stability they had spent decades building. Over time, I came to recognize a difficult personal reality as well. I myself belong to this same aging in recovery cohort. I realized that the very services I was envisioning for others may one day become necessary for me in my own life. That realization transformed this work from an intellectual concern into a deeply personal mission. The individuals now aging in long-term recovery represent a distinct population with unique psychosocial histories, health challenges, trauma exposures, recovery identities, support systems, and service needs. They are not an invisible cohort. Many survived incarceration, homelessness, HIV/AIDS, hepatitis, violence, overdose epidemics, the war on drugs, family estrangement, and profound social stigma. Many rebuilt their lives through recovery principles grounded in abstinence, accountability, peer support, and behavioral transformation. Now they are aging. Yet, most aging systems are not recovery informed, and most recovery systems were never designed for the aging populations. That gap is where Never Alone Home Care Services and the Aging and Recovery Residential Model emerge, not merely as programs, but as a recognition that long-term recovery creates an entirely distinct aging experience that social work, healthcare, public policy, and recovery services have not yet fully understood.
This has been Aging in Recovery. If this topic matters to you, please stay with us as we continue to explore this emerging field.